Today I'm going to show you how to piece a foundation paper piece point for the new sparked pattern. So this is a finished one, and this goes on the corner of your squares that are cut on point. This is the pattern. So it comes with 2 of these on a sheet of paper. So you're going to cut these out, cut along the dotted line. What I actually really like to do instead of cutting on the dotted line is I line up a 1/4 inch mark on my ruler right on top of that solid dark line, and then I rotary cut along there. I use a rotary cutter that I have an old blade in just for paper cutting. So this is our point. These could be done directional with directional fabric, but that would be tricky because you have 4 per block, and so then you'd have to rotate them all. So I try to use non-directional fabric or solid fabric. This is your point fabric. It's cut at 2 1/4 by 5 inches, and this is to cover up this section that's marked 1. Mine is a little different. Mine says C1 because this is an unedited pattern piece. So this is going to go on the back side of the pattern. The front side is the side with the lines. That's the side you want up so that you can see the lines as you sew them. It helps to have a little bit of light behind so you can make sure that we're covering all the section of the piece we need to cover and have a little bit out for our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to take our point fabrics. So this looks like it would go on that side, but since we're on the opposite side, it goes on the opposite, it goes this way. But that's not how you sew it. In order to sew it, you have to flip it right sides together. Does that make sense? Because you always sew with your seams right side together, and then you can flip it out. So the trick with paper piecing is to have a light source behind it, in my opinion. So what I like to do is I'm holding that yellow greenish colored point in place, and I am lining up my fabric behind it. So I want, sometimes you can crease this with your fabric underneath, and that kind of gives you a registration mark. But you want a little bit of extra fabric, a 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch is fine on this side of where you're going to seam. And the tricky part about FPP is, if you've never done it, is that it's kind of done in reverse. So I'm going to go holding these 2 in place. I'm going to stitch right along that first line, and I'm going to stitch all the way through the outer seam allowance. So that's off screen. You will hear my sewing machine for a minute. So I'm going to do that real quick. Okay, so then you have a piece that looks like this. So this is extra. So what I like to do is I fold my pattern piece down, and you can do this with a rotary cutter. They have special rulers even that butt there against that seam, or give you a exact 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you can rotary cut it. But I don't have a cutting mat over here, so I just do a very simple straight cut, keeping it as close to a 1/4 inch seam allowance as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then you flip that back up. Now this is not necessary, but I do recommend these. These are called seam rollers. You're now going to flip this fabric over into the spot that it's supposed to go. And then you're going to roll that seam so that it stays flat. So this is not necessary. You can finger press that seam, but you do want that seam to go flat. Okay, so for your last piece, you're going to take your fabric, and that would be this one. And that goes there. But remember, we need to sew on the other side. So I'm going to flip my fabric right sides together. I'm going to turn it over. And I like to use my fingers and the light again. And I like to line that up. So it's about a 1/4 inch over. A good way to check that is to do a little crease. So you can flip it over and see, oh yeah, I have a 1/4 a 1/4 inch seam again. So I'm going to now sew this black line, and I'm going to go through the seam allowances again all the way out and through the end. I know some people don't do a back stitch at the beginning and end, but I tend to do a back stitch because I like it to be extra strong, and I grew up being taught that. My mom did a lot of garment sewing growing up, so I always do a back stitch at the beginning and end just so it doesn't come open, especially if you're making the quilt over time. So again, you can see there that I have the seam along here and I have this little tail. So I'm going to fold that pattern piece down again. And I am going to just snip it off there. That's going to be for my garbage. So then I have this pattern piece done. So then for finger pressing, see, you can just kind of smush your fingers along there, technical term right there. And then that makes it lay pretty flat. Before I trim this, I am actually going to iron it. So this is our finished pattern piece. This is 1 point of your block. So you need 4 points for block. So this is a finished block. This is a pressed finished block. So see, this was finger pressed and then roller seam pressed. And when you actually use an iron on it, you can see it gets a lot flatter. And don't be afraid to iron it. I even iron with steam with my paper on. So before you pull your papers off, you're going to trim it. So this is a trimmed block. How I like to trim is I like to use a square ruler. This is a 10.5 inch. And I would prefer, let's scoot these out of the way so you can see a little bit better, to lay my piece down. And I am going to match that 1/4 inch line directly over my 1/4 inch seam line on my pattern piece. And I'm going to line it up on that corner. So then I have this lined up and this one lined up, so I can rotary cut along there and along there. So once I have that done, I'm going to flip it, and I'm actually going to do the same thing but lining it up on these little angle parts and cut those, and then I'll flip it and I'll line up my 1/4 inch line again and cut this long one last, and then you'll have a perfect pattern piece just like this. I don't tend to cut those last little notches out. They don't make a difference really in when sewing the pattern together. But yeah, that is how you foundation paper piece a point for the sparked quilt block. If you've never done it before, congratulations. We will get 4 done, and then you'll add those on to either side of your center point. Okay, so we have our 4 points that have been trimmed down, and I'm going to add them to the center on point cut block. Now this fabric is not directional, so it doesn't make a difference. You can cut a regular square and turn it on point, but if you had a directional fabric, you would definitely want to make sure it was cut on point and direction oriented the right way. Okay, first we're going to take this block and we're going to lay it on top of here. I actually, prior to this video, did I folded in half and finger press some little crease marks. So I don't know if you can see them, but there's a little crease mark dead center on each side. And that just helps me know that I'm lining up my block correctly. So I'm going to line this up, and I'm going to try and make sure it's as centered as possible, and then my ends will be just about right. And I'm going to sew right along that dark line. It is a 1/4 inch, and I actually use a 1/4 inch foot on top of sewing along that line, but you don't have to. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, you can just sew on top of it. Okay, our first block is sewn on. I often get these little tails with my thread cutter on my machine, so I'm just gonna clip those right there. You're gonna flip this out and see that you didn't bury your point in there, because you don't want that. And as you can see here, I do have a little bit of a tail on the outside, but that's not a big deal. But before I do anything else, I'm going to actually sew the opposite point on. I'm going to do the same thing, line it up pretty much in the center, line up those edges, and sew along that dark black line. Okay, so now I have my two opposite points on. This is where you take off the papers. Now you could take the paper off. Remember how we foundation paper piece these. You could take the paper off prior to sewing it to your center black. But I like leaving the paper on because you might have a lot of bias edges around here, and it just helps keep everything smooth and together. So to take your papers off, a good tip is to fold them on the sewn line once, and then they kind of just come off. If you use the proper stitch length, which is 1.5 to 1.8, it will be really easy to pull them off. So I just kind of fold and pull because it's basically perforated and it comes off pretty quickly. Okay, here's my 2 points without any paper, and I am going to go press these before I add on the last 2 points. I am going to press them so that the seam allowance goes towards the middle instead of pressing it so the seam allowance goes towards the outside like this, which is harder, that you'll just have a bulkier seam there. The tendency should be for your fabric to go where it will have the least bulk. Okay, as you can see, I have pressed it with both seams going towards the middle of the block, and now I'm going to repeat the process of sewing the points on. You might want to double check. Sometimes with ironing your registration marks can go away, but just double check that they're fine. Now this is a good example. See on this piece how my fabric goes out farther than my actual pattern piece on this side, and up here it lines up because when I was cutting them, just the paper, I cut it smaller than the seam allowance. So that's why I always, when I'm trimming the blocks down, use a ruler with a 1/4 inch and cut on the 1/4 inch, because I might have cut off my dotted line that is my seam allowance line. So in that case, I'm gonna line it up again and sew along this dark line with my 1/4 inch foot. Okay, there's my first block, and I open it up, and it looks pretty good. It looks like I'm gonna have a good amount on each side to trim it down a little bit. So therefore I'm gonna continue. Sometimes if you get too close here, you might wanna unpick it and try and have a little bit more fabric there. Or just sometimes it's just a matter of moving your seam line in, which you have a little play with this block. Once you sew it all together, you do have to trim it down, so you have a little play there. So again, I'm gonna line up that center mark and that edge, and I'm gonna sew it along this dark black line to put on my final corner. Okay, last corner is on, and so you can kind of see that they tend to go towards the middle with the paper on them. This is our last time we have to take the paper off for this block, and then you just press it. black before you sesh it. One thing I would definitely recommend is as you're pulling off papers, be very careful because these bias edges, I can't stress it enough, will stretch and get wavy, but starch is great. And it'll all come out in the final quilt. I've never had a problem. Just to see, you can see a little bit that we've got a little bit of wave here, but so be careful when you're pulling out those pieces that you're not like pulling the fabric. Just hold the fabric in place and pull just the paper. Yeah, so that is your quilt block. Good job. I can't wait to see your sparked quilt.